while you watch me put them into practice with this demo ink drawing of a house, let me explain my ink drawing technique to get realistic looking drawings using a fine line ink pen. In this case, a range of Unipin pens. So I would summarize this drawing technique up as drawing with a light touch. And that's important, to be able to draw with a light touch, because normally the problem with ink is that we draw with what can come across as looking like a rather heavy touch. A touch that ends up looking very the same over the whole drawing and often a bit too cartoon-like as well. We don't get the subtlety, the variation that we get in life. So with this technique, this approach of applying the ink to the paper with a light touch, it helps us to create the possibilities of far greater variety of marks and therefore effects. So the first thing, and this makes it much easier to get a range of effects and a range of marks, is to use a range of pens. Now, we don't have to use a wide range of pens. In this drawing, I'm using three: a 0.2 millimeter, a 0.1 millimeter, and a 0.03. What I would always suggest, though, is that we use the same brand and the same type of pen in any one drawing. We still want to have a consistency between our marks, and we don't want them to look like they've been drawn with different pens, because that's going to detract from the overall effect we're trying to build up. So whenever I buy a single pen, I at least buy two or three in that same brand. Inks look different, the way the ink flows out of the pen looks different, and that creates a different effects. And what happens when you use the pens differently changes. So that's the first thing. Buy a range of pens. Now the more technique-driven things. The first one is to hold the pen very lightly and to hold it halfway down the barrel. If you look at this is a great view right now. You're doing just that. In fact, if I didn't have the cap on the end of the pen, I wouldn't be able to hold it with any control this way. So if you can hold your pen without the cap on, that's probably an indication you're holding it too far down towards the end. Because what we want to be able to do to create light touch marks on the paper is to have very light, fleeting lines. So what I'm doing, besides holding the pen halfway, I'm holding it relatively loosely, and I'm not pressing down on the paper heavily at all. In fact, you'll see that I often do 2 or 3 lines in the one place over the top of each other to build up a darker effect from the marks that the pen leaves. But another way, and this is probably the most significant way, I think, to create great variety of ink on the paper marks from very, very light, barely touching, to much heavier, is to hold the pen at a very strong angle. If I were to be drawing this and hold the pen more vertically, it would force me to draw slower, and it would also mean that more of the tip of the pen would be in contact with the paper for longer, and I'd get a much more even black line. And that's the very thing I'm trying to avoid in order to create a light look on the paper with my ink. Because what I want to be able to do is put lots of light marks on my paper that I can build up and play with and layer to create a more realistic effect. And so the way we hold the pen is vital for that. Now, my third point is the direction that we do our lines. Now, at this point, my lines have all been mostly in the same direction, in the obvious direction, but sometimes whether we go up or down makes a big difference. And if you remembered my drawing the bushes down the bottom in the front of this bay window, you'll see that I was actually going from the ground up, and I was flicking each of the marks, each of the strokes I was making. Now that's important because usually The strongest part of a mark with a fine liner pen is the very start, because we're taking just a split second longer to position our pen on the paper in the right spot. That means more ink is flowing. We're usually pressing a little bit heavier, going a little bit slower. When we flick, as we lift the pen off the paper, we get a more feathered effect. Now, it depends what we're drawing, what's the best direction. There's never a right direction. There's never a right way for anything in drawing, I don't believe. It's what creates the effect that will be beneficial for the overall appearance of my drawing. And in this case, if you look at those bushes, I want a nice light effect because the bushes grow thinner and thinner as they get towards the top. And this is winter, so there are lots of bare branches, and certainly in these bushes along the front. Go back and have another look at how I did that. In fact, if you look carefully, you might notice that for the first bush I began to draw, I actually did it the other way, and I thought, whoa, no, that's not the effect I'm trying to create. Another thing I'll just point out now with this drawing, which you're mostly watching at double speed, but I did speed up to 4 times speed, basically when I did the foliage. Because there was quite a lot of it, and because this isn't a video about foliage, I thought that I would speed that up. But if you want to use that cog icon, you can slow this video down to half speed, and you can watch all of the foliage being done at a slower pace. And of course, you can do this with any video of mine or any other channel for that matter. So there's the direction that we're making the strokes, and particularly paying attention to when we put the pen on the paper, how long it takes us to get a good drawing speed. Or even we can start to bring the pen down and start to move it before it hits the paper so we get a nice even start to our line. But sometimes we actually want a heavier ink feel at the start of the line, especially if a lot of marks are lining up and we want a heavier feel of ink at the bottom. So as I said before, no right way, but it's being aware of the different effects, the different ways we hold our pen and position our marks and progress our marks, the different effects all of those things create, and then we can start to choose what's going to be most helpful. And the final way in my ink drawing technique for a realistic result is to really concentrate on contrasts, on lights and darks. So we're talking about values here. We're talking about hatching, cross-hatching. Hatching is tremendously important. And again, there is no right way to hatch. If you haven't seen my video on the 10 ways I'm aware of, the 10 different ways I use cross-hatching in my drawings to create effects, then that's a video well worth watching. And I might make that the link, the end screen video for this if you haven't seen it, particularly if you're never sure exactly what's the right direction to cross-hatch. This would be a fantastic video because it will kill once and for all the idea that there is a right way, a right direction to cross-hatch. But it will show you a huge range of ways that we can be thinking of cross-hatching, possibilities to create in our drawings from it. And I think that's really helpful then to guide us in knowing how to cross-hatch. The question is never what's the right direction. The question is what effect do I want to create in my drawing in this place. So values, really important. And again, if we've been drawing with a nice light touch and we've got a wide range of marks, it's not just what direction do I hatch in that's going to make a difference, but it's also the different types of marks that we create. And sometimes it might be a single mark drawn very lightly that's going to be significant, and other times it's going to be layering very, if you like, almost fragile marks on top of heavier marks, more certain marks. It all depends what creates the effect, but the more variation of marks that we have to work with our pen, the more skilled we are in producing a range of consistent marks that we can then deliberately vary, the more options we have. And what you'll find is you'll start to become intuitive in varying the marks that you make as you become aware of how holding and using and positioning the pen differently creates a different effect. It's easy to think, well, this is a fine liner pen. It's ink. It just makes a line. The ink is a certain color. Therefore, every mark I make is going to basically be the same. It's the same ink on the paper. And that's not true. That's the focus. That's the way of thinking that ends up creating lots of lines, all very even, lots of outlining, if you like, that ends up looking cartoon-like, because real life has so much variety of edge, of light, of visual effects. So we're trying to use our black pen, our black ink pen, and it is a fine liner pen here I'm talking about. It's different again, I think, with a fountain pen, but I'm not particularly experienced in that. So I'm really talking about when we want to draw with a fine liner pen with a fiber tip, compressed fiber tip, such as I'm doing here. Now, one interesting thing with this drawing, I had intended to make it same size, but you'll have noticed that what happened was when I drew that first bay window, I realized that I'd drawn it larger, noticeably larger than my reference. Now, I wanted to try and keep the whole thing in scale, so if I'd increased in size the first part of this subject, then I had to increase everything to the same degree. And so I took off my guiding tape, which does help me sometimes by providing another reference point, but it particularly helps me just to keep nice, neat marks around the edges. So I had to take that off and then reposition it wider in the three directions that I was going to have pen going on the paper. Now, you're watching here now my using the 0.3 with very light marks. Actually, no, this is a 0.1, I think. You'll see it more clearly in the video than I'm seeing it right now, editing. But notice how I'm building up the overall effect of the foliage. I'm not trying to draw leaves at all, anywhere. I'm building up the overall effect. And even with the branches, there is still an effect that we see all at once rather than really perceiving individual branches. We might perceive the heavier branches, but not all the little twigs at the end. They just become a fuzz. So we want to find marks more that create the effect of that fuzz, rather than get caught up drawing individual leaves. If you haven't seen my video on drawing the effect of detail, rather than having to draw all the detail, that could be incredibly helpful for this. I don't know how you draw trees actually without that technique, and I have a whole playlist on that topic. So getting to the end here now, and it's how much detail. I thought I'm going to have to either indicate the bricks or indicate the shingles on the gable section, because I want to create a difference visually, a distinction between the two possibilities. So I went with the gables, a little more complex, took a little bit more time than I thought, but I really wanted to keep this very light, this part. I really didn't want this to be too much of a standout, because it's not a big standout in real life. It's trying to make the things in the reference that really stand out strongly, stand out in my drawing, and the things that sit back, or we have to look harder to see, I want to draw those with a lighter effect, so that we have to look harder to see them in our drawing. They're not the most obvious thing. When we don't try and create some things with a light touch, what happens is everything is drawn with the same, if you like, focus, and it creates this unnatural feel, even if everything is really accurately drawn. So now, just some final touches. Please hit the like button if you found this helpful. If you have any other thoughts on ink drawing techniques, then please let us know in the comments and share your wisdom and experience with the rest of us. And it's done. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Look, I hope this has been helpful. I've never talked about this in this way before, but why not focus on the handling of your pen for a light touch in the marks you make, and therefore greater ability to create different visual effects and capture reality, perhaps more than you're able to at the moment. But whatever you draw, however you draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.